It was now June 2011, and after 2.5 years in Brisbane, it was great to be back cruising again. Destination Darwin, some 2,400 nautical miles away. We planned to get there by the end of November, the beginning of the cyclone season. Darwin is definitely in the cyclone belt, but thankfully has a few protected marinas, so we decided to risk it. The first stop was Moreton Bay, just outside Brisbane. The anchorage behind the wrecks at Tangalooma didn't seem very secure. This gave us our first introduction to the Queensland coast. Strong southeasterly winds with rolly anchorages. It was also our first anchoring for quite a while, and Keith was frustrated by the anchor chain continually jumping off the windlass gypsy. On inspection, he decided that the first 25 metres of our anchor chain was badly corroded from so much use over the years. As a result, the links no longer fitted snugly on the gypsy. Since we had some 90 metres of chain, he decided we could afford to lose some. So on the way to Mooloolaba, Keith got out the loppers and chopped off the offending amount and dumped it overboard. This improved matters no end. We cut short our stay in Mooloolaba as the good weather continued. Light winds meant that we motored towards Fraser Island. After a still night at anchor at Double Island Point, we entered the sandy straits through the notorious Wide Bay Bar. Cruiser tales abound about this regularly moving sandbar with rolling surf and numerous shipwrecks. Our experience was far from this. With help from the local volunteer marine rescue, who gave us very specific waypoints to get through, we did surf a little as we entered the straits, but it was an easy crossing. We took the tide through the shallow sandy straits and ended up anchored off the Kingfisher Resort in Hervey Bay. Keith organised a trip around Fraser Island. It is the largest sand island in the world and some 100 kilometres long. The ocean side is a long beach that is used as a main highway, and if you were lucky, you could spot passing humpback whales. Surprisingly, although the island is one big beach, it is covered in subtropical rainforest with towering pines and eucalyptus trees, huge freshwater lakes and streams. It's an amazing place. The tracks are treacherous and four-wheel drive is essential. Gladstone was our next main stopover. Rob and Gemma from Orinoco Flow had settled there after their trip across the Pacific a few years earlier. We were now in day sailing mode and planning to get as far north as we could in day hops. Bundaberg and Pancake Creek were our intermediate stops before we pulled into Gladstone Marina. It was lovely to catch up with Rob and Jem. We spent nearly a week there doing a bit of maintenance and helping them landscape their garden, mainly by applying layers of mulch on their extensive garden beds. Rob, a doctor, also arranged for Keith to have the necessary blood tests for his first telephone consultation with the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane in a couple of weeks' time. He also provided the necessary forms for Keith's next blood tests. The period of light winds was replaced by steady southeasterlies. To take advantage of these, we headed north, the sandy islands of Moreton Bay and Fraser being replaced by rugged rocky islands, submerged mountaintops from some long ago mountain range, now covered in impregnable scrub. We were within the protection of the Great Barrier Reef and were hopeful of clear, warm water and calm seas. When we arrived at Great Keppel, we discovered that there were huge land and sea military exercises with the US being held in this 10,000 square kilometre wilderness. The area was closed until the end of the month. Fortunately, this was due to finish in a few days, and cruisers were stacking up waiting in the transit area. While at Great Keppel Island, Charlotte, Keith's youngest daughter, graduated from Nottingham University with a degree in nursing. Once again, we were very proud and disappointed at not being able to attend her graduation ceremony. Missing both Rob's and Charlotte's graduations, amongst many of the key moments in the children's lives, was one of the hardest sacrifices we made. Finally, on the 1st of August, when the military exercises were finished, there was a mass exodus. The forecast was for strong winds for a few days, so most boats decided to hole up at Island Head Creek, a few miles further north. After a calm night at anchor, we had surprise visitors. At around 10:30 in the morning, a police boat turned up, complete with armed Border Patrol officers, Marine Police and Coast Guard. We had seen the Coast Guard cutter at anchor in the creek, and they were using the opportunity to check all the boats in the area, supposedly doing safety checks, etc., including breathalyzing suspects. We were sitting in the cockpit having morning tea when they arrived. They must have seen an empty beer can from the night before, as they insisted Keith take a breathalyzer test, much to his indignation. And I was annoyed that they automatically assumed that the male was the helmsman. They then proceeded to check our safety equipment and documentation. Eventually they left satisfied, and we could enjoy the quiet anchorage again. It was a great sail to Middle Percy, a picturesque palm-fringed island. On the beach, there's a large A-frame building, built as a meeting place for cruisers. Many visitors have left a memento of their passing. Not to be outdone, we painted Poco's name and logo on a piece of driftwood and nailed it up for others to see. It was great to see the names of other cruising friends who had passed this way previously. While at anchor, we had a visit from one of the other boats, passing on an invitation from the residents of the island to a goat stew the next night, with a donation of vegetables being gratefully received. Armed with a bag of veggies and a bottle of wine, we joined the other 20 or so guests at the A-frame. Behind was a huge fire and large cooking pot. Standing on the table was a lovely baby goat frolicking around. "Is that dinner?" Keith asked. Unfortunately not. The menu has been changed to roux stew. The hunting the day before had not gone well. The wild goats on the island were too elusive, although a kangaroo had succumbed. The evening wore on, beer and wine consumed. Some volunteered to prepare the vegetables, which were duly added to the pot. Partway through the evening, a bleat was heard from a backpack hanging off one of the chairs. The backpack owner uncovered a hungry joey from the pack. It was passed to a willing visitor for bottle feeding. Conversation continued, and after a few more beers, it was revealed that the joey's mum was the guest of honour at the dinner. Both Keith and I lost our appetites and crept back to the boat. We've eaten many different things on our travels, including kangaroo, but this was a bit too basic for comfort. We were now in the Northumberland Island group, commonly known as the Whitsundays. Captain Cook named many of these islets after geographical locations in the north of England, such as Penrith, St Bees, Carlisle, Keswick, etc. We decided to stop off at Scawfell Island and then Brampton. Brampton was another resort island, now closed pending redevelopment following cyclone damage. There was one lonely caretaker on the island, stopping looters from taking stuff. We couldn't see the attraction of the island. It was okay, but we'd seen much nicer ones on the way, so development into a 5-star resort didn't seem to make sense to us. The only good thing for us was the island's good telephone and internet connection. We had been listening to the ABC News during our trip, and one item intrigued us: Australia's 5-yearly census. They provided a phone number for people to call if they hadn't received the form. Keith and I were interested in how they coped with people like us. In Australia, there's a large population of transients, grey nomads, cruisers, backpackers, and workers in remote locations. As a test, I phoned the helpline. The first question was the hardest: what is your address? Not surprisingly, they couldn't cope with "at anchor off Brampton Island." After much discussion, we settled upon Beach Road, Brampton Island. Eventually, I was given a password so that we could complete the online forms. When we did this, it was apparent that this transient sector of society has been totally overlooked. Basically, we were classed as homeless and living on the streets, which sure didn't correlate. We were living in a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom abode, and our previous year's income was in the higher income level. Very interesting. Keith also took the opportunity to phone Princess Alexandra Hospital for his consultation with the specialists. They had received his fax with the blood test results and confirmed his condition was stable. Yippee! We were also pleased that our strategy for obtaining blood tests in remote locations and subsequent phone consultations appeared to be working. The doctor was highly amused to have his patient phoning from a yacht at anchor off a remote Queensland island. We were now in the southern Whitsunday Islands, and winds were forecast to move to the north. We awaited the return of the southerly airstream at anchor on the south side of Goldsmith Island. It was a lovely anchorage, hardly visited. At low tide, the beach was covered in blue soldier crabs marching along the beach, and large rays patrolled the shallows. The wind turned southerly in the middle of the third night, so we upped anchor under bright moonlight and moved 5 miles around to the sheltered north side of the island. In daylight, we moved to Shore Island further north. This was a good anchorage for a stop for a while, do some laundry and attend to some boat chores. I was really pleased with the new washing machine, especially the spin cycle, which reduced the drying time considerably. The warm 20-knot winds helped as well. In settled weather, we headed for Lindeman Island, where we came across a humpback whale and her new calf, surprisingly close. Although we'd seen whales regularly on our trip north, they were usually too far away to get good photos. This pair were within 100 metres of the boat. We stopped for a while and watched this amazing creature. It looked like Mum was using the protected and shallow waters to teach her new baby how to dive. Following a lovely walk on the island, we sailed past Hamilton Island and anchored in Sid Harbour on Whitsunday Island. Here we caught up with Magic Carpet. We had crossed the Pacific with them, and it was great to catch up with Chris and Karen again. They were moving to Nara Inlet on Hook Island to ride out more northerly winds, and we joined them for a great evening, swapping news over dinner. It was a slow haul along the Queensland coast. The overriding impression on our trip north was that there are thousands of kilometres of coastline with no signs of human habitation. I used the time to study for the SEMA accounting exams after all key snagging. I'd finally decided it was time to get some formal qualifications for the work I'd been doing for years. In all, we were disappointed with the Great Barrier Reef cruising. We felt that a bit of tourist development would go a long way and could be done without risk to the environment. There seems to be a policy of herding everyone to the major spots: Whitsunday Island, Airlie Beach, the Cairns Cape Tribulation Strip. The rest, it seemed, picked up a few crumbs and battled with the environmentalists to develop or expand their facilities. I did love Bowen though, a sleepy little town waiting for the good times to happen. Lovely beaches, happy-go-lucky attitude. The mining boom may or may not happen here. Magnetic Island had a good anchorage, unpretentious, lovely walks, a great place just to chill, so we did. We thought Sid Harbour was the best anchorage in the Whitsunday Islands. A great walk to the summit, beaches okay, lovely surroundings. We ended up coming back here 3 times on our trip around the islands. We also grew to like Cairns, a town with lots going on and good facilities and very welcoming. The Low Isles had the best snorkelling so far. It reminded us of the islands in the Pacific and Caribbean. And Hinchinbrook Island, visually a spectacular island, but unfortunately most of it is inaccessible. With a little imagination from the Department of Parks and Wildlife, this could be turned into a great getaway holiday destination for walks and outdoorsy types. We anchored off Cairns for 3 weeks, mainly to repair our refrigeration again. The original evaporation plate had finally succumbed to galvanic corrosion. While at Cairns, we took a trip into the hills on the Kuranda Scenic Mountain Railway. The historic carriages meander through the World Heritage ancient rainforest to the pretty town of Kuranda. and then we returned by cable car, which kissed the tops of the trees on its journey down to the coast. Another time we hired a car and ventured inland to the Atherton tablelands. And even encountered our first duck-billed platypus frolicking in one of the many mountain streams. We were day sailing with lots of stops, only averaging about 20 miles a day. We needed to get our skates on. The cyclone season was creeping up on us. Cooktown in far north Queensland is named in honour of Captain Cook, whose ship the Endeavour limped in here after running aground on the Great Barrier Reef just south of here. If Cook hadn't successfully repaired his ship, then Australians would probably now be speaking French. Cooktown Harbour is small and estuarine, complete with crocodiles. We arrived at low water springs with a blustery northeasterly wind creating a nasty chop. After trying to anchor 3 times, and each time ending up on the sandbank, the local onlookers took pity on us and allowed us to tie up alongside a local fishing boat. I now had sympathy with Captain Cook's plight. Departing Cooktown, the last taste of civilization for a while, our journey continued northwards, the next destination being Lizard Island. This is the most northerly destination on the east coast that most Australian cruisers aspire to reach, and what a lovely spot it is. Well worth the effort. A lovely anchorage, glorious walks, and the company of many cruisers keen to party. It was here that Captain Cook climbed the mountain in search of an exit through the Great Barrier Reef. The view from the top of Cook's Lookout is stunning, right out to beyond the barrier. We spent a week there, just chilling, with the knowledge that, after leaving this idyllic spot, conditions would get tougher. The winds on the Queensland coast in the last quarter of the year are reasonably predictable, southeasterly 15 to 20 knots. Our departure from Lizard Island was no exception. We were making good time, so decided to leave behind Howick Island, a popular stopover, and press on to Ninian Bay. This is one of those places that, from the chart, looks like a great shelter, but in reality was miserable. The bay is too shallow to tuck into, therefore we had to anchor out in an exposed spot. The wind steadily increased to 25 to 30 knots during the night. At dawn, we decided to run for Flinders Island for shelter. As we rounded Cape Melville, the winds were over 30 knots, complete with heavy squalls and reducing visibility. Progress was slow and, as luck would have it, shipping was heavy. We decided to cut short our run and tuck in behind Cape Melville. We ended up staying here for 3 days and rode out 50-knot winds. After slowly dragging anchor, Keith laid a second anchor and Poker sat there comfortably until the winds abated. When we finally reached Flinders Island, we found a very protected anchorage and quite a few places of interest ashore. Rock art, burial sites, etc. It was a shame we hadn't been able to reach it before the storms. Time was now marching on. We pressed on to Portland Roads, 3 days away, mainly to get mobile phone reception. We had a few phone calls to make, and we responded to a few emails at this small community. Before heading off for Margaret Bay. At Margaret Bay, there was a path across the headland lined with items of blue left there by fellow cruisers to show the way, and at the end, all the debris was collected in a hut. It was very interesting. Ever northward we sailed. Our next destination, Cairncross Island. This was just a stopover before the final stretch to around Cape York, the most northerly point of mainland Australia. With a good breeze behind us, we set off for this next staging post. However, when we arrived at the anchorage, it looked uninviting. We decided to continue to Escape River and arrived just as it was getting dark. It was also low water. We started to feel our way up the river, the only hazard shown on the chart and pilot being a rock on the starboard side. I spotted the rock, and Keith on the helm gave it a wide berth. We were feeling confident, proceeding ahead. All of a sudden, we came to an abrupt stop with an almighty bang. Poker had hit an uncharted rock. Keith put the engine hard astern and crept backwards. Thankfully, we were off. I went below, no water flowing in, but where to go if the charts couldn't be trusted? Discretion being the better part of valour, we turned around and found a suitable spot at the river entrance and dropped anchor alongside a myriad of pearl rafts. A safe but restless and uncomfortable night ensued. Keith couldn't dive to inspect the damage as we were in murky, crocodile-infested waters. As you can guess, we didn't stay here long and headed out early the next morning to around Cape York. This is the most northerly point of Australia, and we had sailed north for weeks past vast areas of unspoiled wilderness and could now turn west towards Darwin, a further 750 nautical miles away. An easy sail found us in Seychelles that evening, a lovely, well-protected anchorage where we could refuel ourselves and Poco, ready for the wilds of Arnhem Land. With a fair breeze, we left Seychelles for the 250-odd mile passage across the Gulf of Carpentaria to Truan Island. The first day, Poco was sailing with a useful 10 knots of breeze, but during the night the wind fell away, so the engine went on. The wind didn't return for most of our journey across the top end, as this part of Australia is affectionately called. The whole journey became a bit of a drudge. No wind, isolated and uninspiring anchorages, no other yachts, no coconut palm beaches, just hot and dusty scrubland dotted with craggy rocks with the occasional cute wallaby popping its head up. One highlight was the exciting trip through the hole in the wall. It seemed like the whole of the Gulf of Carpentaria flowed through this narrow gap, about 1.5 kilometres long but only about 20 metres wide at its narrowest point. This gap cuts a channel through the Wessel Islands and has to be taken on the right tide. The approach is daunting. You steer directly for a sheer cliff face until, at the last moment, the gap appears. Poco Andante was picked up by the strong current and zoomed through, achieving 12.2 knots. We were through in 10 minutes and spat out the other end. Across the whole of the top end, we were nervous about swimming. There were warnings about box jellyfish and crocodiles everywhere. Although neither of us saw one, their tracks on the beaches were everywhere, so we were very wary. The lack of wind meant fuel usage was much higher than anticipated. We had to find somewhere to refuel. Thankfully, an Australian customs launch passed by. They called us on VHF to check our details, so I took the opportunity to ask if they knew where we could buy fuel. They suggested the Aboriginal community on Elcho Island, only 10 miles away, and advised that we would need to get permission to land first, and gave me the telephone number of the authorities on the island. Thankfully, there was mobile phone reception as we got closer. I called the chief administrator of the island and got the okay to land, and I also got the number of the fuel depot and arranged to get some fuel. We anchored off the beach, littered with abandoned tinnies and outboards, and the local children were frolicking in the shallows and were amused by our arrival. The owner of the fuel depot helped by driving down to the beach to pick up and refill our containers. We stayed overnight and, with sufficient fuel, we continued island hopping to Port Essington 4 days away. The weather continued benign, but it was not without its hazards. A solitary cloud appeared on the horizon. As it crept closer, it became clear that this cloud was creating a huge turbulence, and we could see a waterspout developing underneath. This was unnerving as it crept closer. We ended up playing cat and mouse game for about half an hour with this beauty. At one point it was so close that you could see the waves created by the gale-force winds at its foot. Poco Andante was now in the spawning ground for cyclones. The growing frequency of afternoon squalls and electrical storms was evidence that the monsoon season was racing up on us. Early settlers had tried to create the first economic centre in Northern Australia at Port Essington, a large natural harbour rivalling Darwin, which was established 50 years later. Things hadn't worked out, and this outpost was abandoned. We spent a week enjoying the area. There were many bays and creeks to explore, and the fishing was successful. At last, Keith was able to take advantage of the crystal clear water to inspect the damage from our encounter in the Scape River. Luckily, it was, as suspected, a big chunk about the size of his fist out the front of the keel. Nothing that half a kilo of epoxy filler wouldn't cure it when the next haul-out happened. It was now late November, and Poco and Dante was booked into Bayview Marina in Darwin for the 1st of December. We finished our stay at Port Essington with a visit to a secluded eco-lodge, only accessible by air or sea. An afternoon propping up the bar was a nice way to end our trip. Darwin was about 120 miles away, an overnighter. The tides in this area are notorious, up to 7 and 8 metre range, therefore timing was all important. We left Port Essington at 9 a.m. and hit the tide to round Cape Don just right. With 8 knots of tide behind us, we were swept into the Van Diemen Gulf and encountered 20 knots of following wind which helped us on. Through overfalls and steep seas, we ploughed on until we reached the centre of the Gulf. Then, like someone turning the switch, the wind died and we were motoring again. As night fell, you could see the storm clouds building and, as luck would have it, our autopilot died again. Keith quickly rigged up our backup tiller pilot, and I gingerly started to navigate through the many hazards in the Gulf. Just before dark, the heavens put on a magnificent display of lightning. We watched the development of a huge superstorm cell directly above us, an amazing sight. Our first hope was that we could outrun it. Our second hope was to go around it, but due to navigational limitations, we finally decided that prayer was the only answer. The tiller pilot was struggling to cope with the tempestuous winds and currents, so it was back to hand steering for me. The sky was as dark as a tomb, and lightning crashed all around. Keith was convinced Poco would be hit, and the smell of the ozone was intense. The wind blew up to 40 knots, but thankfully the seas didn't build as well. We navigated through the narrow passes with fast-running turbulent tides. I was steering by the light of the compass with regular updates from Keith for course changes. The only time I could see the islands either side of us was during the frequent lightning strikes. There were no navigation lights at all. It seemed to last an eternity, but in truth probably only lasted a couple of hours. The storm finally moved away, and the last leg into Darwin passed comfortably. At dawn, we anchored in Fanny Bay and ended our sailing for the year. Darwin is a crossroads for many people, and we were on our own crossroad again. Our original plan had been to cruise the Kimberley region of Western Australia, but after the boring and tedious trip across the top end, we couldn't face continuing on to the Kimberleys, which sounded like much the same, except for the addition of a few gorges, stunning anchorages, enormous tides, and devoid of people. Keith and I held a boat meeting and decided that, if we could both find work that we enjoyed, we would stay in Darwin for the cyclone season, top up the cruising kitty, and also arrange for Keith to have another blood test. If all was well, we could contemplate continuing on to Southeast Asia. I arranged a flying visit to Sydney and successfully passed my 5 SEMA exams in a week, and found work in Darwin as a management accountant for a large property development company. Keith also got a contract with Toll Marine Logistics, mainly looking after their subsidiary in East Timor, which was to prove useful later on. The oppressive humidity of the wet season was truly amazing. Although we'd worked through the wet season in Venezuela, Darwin was almost unbearable. We succumbed and bought a car. It had been 9 years since we'd last owned a car, but it was just too hot and wet to walk in Darwin. Bayview Marina was in a protected inlet, and it had an entrance lock due to the enormous tides, up to 6 metre range. This resulted in almost no breezes, and the heat was stifling. We bought a second-hand air conditioner and mounted it above one of our overhead hatches. We put tarpaulins spread all over the top of the boat to try and keep the wet out, and we sweltered. What we hadn't expected was that Darwin would be so much fun. It's difficult to understand as the climate sucks. There are 3 seasons. The dry is May to October, no rain, none at all, and temperatures cool down to about 28 degrees. The build-up, November and December, that's when we had arrived, 90% humidity, 36 degrees C, thunderstorms and huge clouds. And the wet season, January through to April, torrential rain, dramatic thunderstorms and cyclones. Keith's theory is that Darwinians figure that the climate totally sucks, so let's have fun. Darwin was booming economically. It was host to a large number of capital projects, mainly driven by a $1.7 billion natural gas project, lots of mining nearby, and other government-funded projects. Unemployment was down to around 0.5%, so to satisfy this workforce demand, large numbers of workers are fly-in, fly-out, which led to accommodation and skills shortages. You may think that Darwin, being a capital city, is a teeming metropolis. Think again. The Northern Territory, which is about the size of Germany or Texas, has a population of just 250,000 people, and 90% of them live in Darwin. This translates to lots of facilities and not too many people to use them. It also means a small village temperament. You can stand in the supermarket and chat to the mayor or have a beer with the chief minister. Darwinians survive the wet season mostly by partying at the local hostelries, holing up in air-conditioned homes and watching the rainfall. We joined the local Diana Beach Yacht Club, which holds wet season races. Keith helped crew one of the other marina yachts, which brightened up every other Sunday. The tides are a limiting factor. The yacht club also has live music nearly every night, and it's just a covered arena, a bar and a bistro, and good company. When the rain stops, Darwin bursts into bloom. Concerts, shows, events every weekend, iconic places like the Deck Chair Cinema set up, showing movies every night down at the waterfront. It's like watching a movie in someone's back garden, complete with beer and barbecue. You can catch a film under the stars, with fireflies twinkling and the odd possum wandering about. We were told that sometimes a visit by a wayward snake causes a bit of a commotion. Sitting out on the beach watching the sunset and picking up a meal at the Asian-style Mindle Beach markets was also a great pastime. Beaches here were different. Yes, there were broad white sandy beaches, warm water, occasional surf. However, the water is occupied by crocodiles, jellyfish and other nasties. Swimming is confined to the swimming pools. Courtesy of my employer, I got to go to Ladies' Day at the Darwin Race Week and had to buy a fascinator for the occasion. And we both got to go to the Darwin Turf Club ball. 2,000 people sitting down to a silver service meal under the stars next to the beach. Followed by a day at the races. Ascot, eat your heart out. As an aside, Darwin Racetrack is unique. Many years ago, some bright spark came up with a solution to solve the dust problem caused by galloping horses. He decided to spray the course with used motor oil. This practice continues today, so the jockeys, horses and some spectators get covered in the black oily mess after each race. Kakadu National Park was the venue for Keith's 60th birthday, and we enjoyed a fantastic long weekend there. It is certainly an amazing place, and the Aboriginal artworks are astounding. With stable blood results, Keith had gradually extended the intervals between his tests. We'd both invariably get nervous in the week before he had his checkup, but the 6-monthly results were still unchanging. I was able to go back onto HRT patches, which was a relief, especially with the combination of hot flushes and Darwin's tropical heat. We also got to catch up with Keith's children when Rob, his son, married Jasmini. Jaz's parents hail from Singapore, but moved to Malaysia many years ago. There were formal events in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur and Penang over a 2-week period. It all went really well, and it was delightful to see all the kids happy and flourishing in their lives. latest plan, having survived the first wet season, was to stay and work in Darwin until we had saved enough money to purchase a future house in Australia, with the proviso that we were both happy in our work and play. We were on track, but although the playtime was fun, the work became tedious. Both Keith and I felt that our skills were being undervalued and underutilised. It was a tough decision to give up a 6-figure salary and the comfortable lifestyle for a second time. But hey, what the heck? Life was too short and we weren't getting any younger. The decision was made. Poco and Dante signed up for the Sail Indonesia Rally, leaving Darwin in July 2013. While we were contemplating our future, there were a few unfinished items to attend to. Firstly, Keith got his Australian citizenship. This would allow us greater options in the future. His time in remote Darwin entitled him to apply slightly sooner than the requisite 4 years of residency. Secondly, we just had to tick the box and finish our circumnavigation of Australia, the easy way by road. All that was left was the gap between Darwin and Broome. Keith took a break from his latest contract with the Northern Territory Government's Department of Remote Housing, and I resigned from my job. We purchased a tent and a blow-up bed and headed west. After Katherine, we were in new territory. The drive west was through rich savanna, littered with termite mounds and baobab trees. The landscape, much like Africa, but without the large game roaming around, was full of Brahman cattle to supply steaks for the barbecue. The road continued and wound its way through the rich red escarpments until it reached Kununurra. Kununurra was a worthwhile place to stop. Not glamorous, but it gave us an inkling of what could be achieved in this remote part of the Kimberley. The Ord River Dam was completed in 1972, creating Lake Argyle, the largest man-made lake in Australia. This opened the floodgates for an irrigation scheme. The instigators designed it to create a food bowl in this region and to provide employment for the local Indigenous population. A great plan, but for one small flaw. The soil and conditions were great for food production, and although there were many small productive farms in the area, one enterprising company noted that the climate was ideal for growing sandalwood. Thousands of acres of these trees were planted. This slow-growing parasitic cash crop, used in the cosmetic industry, was, in 2013, only just being harvested for the first time after 14 years of waiting. A far cry from the plan that the visionaries of the Ord River Dam were hoping for. Lake Argyle is also famous for the mining of coloured diamonds, yellows and pinks. About 400 kilometres south are the recently discovered Bungle Bungles. Until the late 1980s, nobody knew of their existence. Not a lost tribe or a new life form, but an entire range of mountains. Not easily missed, one would have thought. This mountain range consists of soft sandstone which has been eroded into beehive shapes with huge canyons across wide escarpments. They are remote. To get there we had the choice of a 2-day hike, drive in by 4-wheel drive or fly. We chose a flying tour. It was spectacular. Touristy bits done in Kununurra, we continued heading west. After 3 days, Keith discovered that the 5-centimetre gap on his map was actually around 2,000 kilometres long. "Are we there yet?" became his mantra. Not much else to say about this trip. We arrived in Broome after travelling through 3 or 4 small towns, mainly Aboriginal communities, and crossed our original path of 4 years ago. Last time we had entered Broome from the west, this time from the east. We stopped one night, had a great meal overlooking Cable Beach, and turned around and drove back 2,000 kilometres to Darwin. Mad or what? That trip and our earlier short break by airline to Tasmania completed our exploration of this huge and empty continent. After Darwin's heat, it was great to be cool again. The climate and flora is so different from the Northern Territory. Green, forested and craggy mountains, much like the UK in topography. Not surprising, Tasmania was one of the first places to be colonised. A huge prison and town was built at Port Arthur in European style. Their separate prison system signalled a shift from physical punishment to psychological punishment. This was the forerunner of our modern prison systems, incorporating punishment by isolation, silence and reflection. Many of the inmates became the forefathers of modern Australia once their time had been served. Others filled the mental asylum as a result of their incarceration. Tasmania has lots of apple orchards, breweries and other pleasurable indulgences. The state has a huge artistic community, spawning the creation of the Mona Gallery, Museum of Old and New Art, which has some huge and controversial modern art installations. I'm not sure that I would call them art, but they were very clever from an engineering viewpoint. Before we left Australia, we wanted to visit Emily and John, who had now moved to Perth. We spent a hot, 42 degrees C, week there around Christmas time. The only cool place was a dip in the sea, followed by a visit to the air-conditioned shopping malls. We also enjoyed a farewell visit with my niece Pippa and her son Xavier in Sydney. Apart from these excursions, life just revolved around turning Poco and Dante into a boat again after being our partner for 18 months. We reluctantly acknowledged that our poor dinghy, which had survived the stabbing in Panama, was finally beyond repair. We ordered a brand new Zodiac dinghy. Despite my reluctance, Keith insisted on a visit to the jumping crocodiles in the Adelaide River. This was really iconic, a leisurely boat trip complete with a bucket full of pigs' heads used as bait. Amazing to see these huge carnivores jumping up and snatching the bait at close proximity. It gave us respect for these animals. It also illustrated why swimming is not advisable in the Northern Territory. We were finally ready to resume cruising. Our next destination, Southeast Asia.